Yep. All right. So again, for those of you who are joining us, this is my talk on how to work with your engineering lead to help grow your career. And to get started, a little bit about who am I. First of all, this is not me. I know you see my last name and people think this a lot. My last name is Sirchia. It's not Sriracha, but it's okay. I kind of, live by this moniker and I go with it wherever I go. So this is kind of my good joke slide to kind of break the ice on any talk that I do. But this is who I am. My name is Robert Sirchia. I'm a senior technical evangelist here at SUSE, part of the SUSE Ranch community. I specialize in cloud native development and cloud operations. And I love to learn. And one of the things that kind of solidifies my knowledge of learning something is when I can teach it to somebody else, right? Because you really, can benchmark how much you know something is how well you can teach it to someone else. So I like to obviously learn and teach it back. You can follow me on Twitter or you can connect with me on Polywork. That's how I met Darren, is through Polywork. It's my new choice to connect with people. Feel free to reach out. You'll see Robert Cirque as my moniker pretty much anywhere you go. Love to keep the conversation going. So a bit of background. This is a picture of me with my development staff in the Philippines at my previous employer. And I was telling Darren before this started, one of my favorite places to go is Makati City, where we had an office. And I got to fly out there and teach these individuals how to do cloud native development, which was a lot different from the traditional, server web tier architecture that we were constantly doing. But a bit of the background is I've led the large engineering teams around, I think the largest team I had was 75 people. On multi-million-dollar projects. A lot of these were rebuilding applications to run in Pivotal Cloud Foundry, or rerunning applications off of client servers to be running in Kubernetes as well. And with the full spectrum of skill sets. So I had database developers, I had front-end developers, I even had middle-tier developers who were doing either .NET, Java, that. And like I said previously, I've had team members from the Philippines, India, the PRC, even in Europe now today. I've worked with people from across the world. And with all that, this is some of the things that I've learned throughout having a lot of junior developers. Now, with my previous employer, I've had junior developers assigned to us quite frequently. In fact, that was part of our model where we would have a farm team of individuals coming in of either a tech school or college or self-taught, and these individuals would be with their varying skill sets. And so I was accustomed to using and working with junior developers, but I wasn't necessarily the best lead starting off. So this talk is some of the things that we've learned to help you navigate working better with your engineering lead to get the most out of your relationship with that individual. So let's talk about your lead and communicating, right? So there's a couple of things about a developer lead or an engineering lead that everyone needs to kind of understand, right? They have a day job, right? And being your lead is probably the lowest priority of their day job, right? They still have to close tickets. They still have to close their cards. They have coding to do. They have meetings to attend. They have to do everything that you have to do. And yet they have to also be your lead. So that's a hard concept because most companies look at it going, yeah, this is something you do. Like it's that you just got to do it on top of your day job. And so it's very difficult, but I want to make sure I call it out because it is an important thing to know that they do have, every lead has a day job. And a lot of companies don't acknowledge the fact that they have responsibilities to individuals who are not necessarily below them in structure, but below them in experience. You might not be the responsibility, right? And so this was kind of frequently I saw is that, junior developers would gravitate to a senior that answered their first question, right? And it wasn't necessarily their lead, and that senior developer wasn't necessarily their they weren't really responsible for having a junior underneath them, but it just kind of happened that way. So it's leveling with some of the expectations of that. There might be other developers underneath them, or engineers for that matter. And if they are, your time is split, right? So they have a day job and there might be 2 or 3 individuals assigned to them. So you are a priority, but you might not be the highest priority, and they have other individuals that they're talking to. Probably not your manager. I've only seen one instance where that was the case, but it's just kind of a weird dichotomy. So I want to make sure that I call that out. They're kind of a guiding force, not a managerial force. But the vast majority of them might not know how to be a lead, right? And so understand that it's might be new for them as it might be new for you coming into coding if you're new to this, or if you're, in a career change and you're coming in from a different perspective. But lastly, they're human, right? And so they're going to make mistakes. They're going to have good days. They're going to have bad days. And it was something we always want to remember, as frustrating as it might be on your end, it's just as frustrating. It could be even more frustrating on theirs. But the one thing about your lead is they're a wealth of knowledge. You just have to find that knowledge within them, okay? But on the inverse side, a little bit about a new developer or an engineer for that matter. I know there's a difference between engineers and developers, but I use that term here kind of loosely and then interchangeably. So if I do understand, I'm talking to both, because these are some of the things that do crossover in that. This might be their first job, right? Right out of college, first job, you got a computer science degree, or in my case, computer information systems degree, and this is your first job out of college or tech school, right? This could be their second career. And I know this personally. My wife is actually a former chemistry major, she's a chemistry major, formerly a chemistry manager. She managed a chemistry lab, and now she's a React developer. So this might be, a lot of times, this might be someone's second career. Big thing to remember is they might not know what level they're at, right? And what I mean by that is sometimes, and we all have imposter syndrome, it hits us, everybody. And if someone says that they don't they're not affected by it, I'd question their capabilities in the technical sense. But we all have it. And so with that being said, that new developers really don't know what level they're at. And so a lot of times what I've seen is individuals just need the confidence of going, yeah, I understand this concept. I understand what this is. They just need a reassurance from the other side. And inversely, they might think that they're better at something that they're really not that good at. They might not know how to be a developer, right? And there's a big difference between knowing how to code and knowing how to be a developer, right? And I'll talk about this later, because being a developer and you're working in any environment, unless you're by yourself, and if you're by yourself, then you might not need this talk. But if you are working in an environment that you're developing code for an organization or a company or an NGO, that all of a sudden you have other processes in place, right? And we'll talk about just things like pull requests, how to pick up a card, how to close a card, what is a card, if they're agile, if they're waterfall. Those are things that come with being a coder and being a developer, that there's not one and the same in every instance. So we want to make sure that they, some people might not understand, what's responsible in a card. Do you fix a bug that you find, or do you open a new card for that? So we'll talk about that here in a minute. Lastly, they're human. And just like that, as a new developer in any of these roles, they're going to have good days. They're going to have bad days. It all depends, but they're a wealth of knowledge. You just have to find it. Now, I put that on both, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would a new developer, how do they have a wealth of knowledge? And what I want to address is that as a new developer, you have a different perspective that you bring to the team, right? If you are an individual who's coming in and this is your second career, you might have done something differently. You have a different point of view. You have a different background. When you see something, attacking a problem head on might not be the way you would have normally done it, but you give a different perspective, and you can give a development team a whole new perspective on what's going on in there, because you have a different perspective. And the same thing with college students that are coming right out of a tech school or university or whatever it might be. Your professors might have had a different way of doing it, and you can bring a different insight to it, right? And so we want to address it, that on both sides there's knowledge to be transferred. As a lead should be learning from they're junior developers and vice versa. And about both these individuals, they might have things going on that you don't know about, right? And I want to address this because this is one of the hardest things that I didn't understand earlier in my career when I first got assigned a junior developer, right? Is that they have personal lives and they bring it to work, and you can't just say, no, that doesn't, you leave it at home, leave it at home, leave it at home, because sometimes it does bleed over. And you have to be empathetic to what might be going on in their lives on both sides of the house, right? And so your lead developer might be having a really bad day, or they might be having something personally going on. So it's just setting the stage and working with them to understand that there's things that they're not going to tell you that might be affecting them. So we want to talk about the channels of communication, right? And this was one of the things that I want to talk about, and it's why it's important, is because how do you want to communicate? And should it be a cell phone call, right? And when should you be calling on a cell phone? Should it be a text message, or I don't know, maybe a Zoom call? Or do you want the cameras on or the cameras off? I've been a remote employee for 10 plus years in my career, so I'm used to talking to the camera. And I'm used to being on camera, and some people it's a little more daunting than not. Now, in the age of COVID, cameras have become almost the norm, but when is it appropriate? Should it be a Slack message, email? You know, these are some of the communications. But what I've learned is that cell phone call better be like, oh my God, something's broken, there's an emergency. It has to be important. So I always say, try to use that as your last resort, because people have personal lives. But with a Zoom call, pretty much the standard default for, you know, something needs a deeper explanation, right? Or you're having a touch point. A Zoom call can be, you know, in person if you're in the office, where, like I said, we're in the age of COVID. Some people are going back, some people are not. And at any given time, we could be shutting it down. So, you know, Zoom call can be analogous to being in person. But when it's something needs to do like a deeper explanation, don't put it through Slack, don't put it through email, pick up the Zoom and just call. And then Slack, obviously the general async message. If you don't need to know right away, just put it in there, and it's and you know, you could be on Teams or whatever, Slack, Discord, for whatever Slack channel or text communication platform your company might be using. But ask to see what the best way to communicate, right? And so I've been on teams where we texted each other, and then we'd get annoyed with one another so fast and so quickly that we would just pick up the phone and call, be like, what do you need? Do you need this? Okay, I'll fix it right now. And it didn't work well. So these are some of the things that we found out that works a lot better with teams and with individuals when you're trying to communicate, especially with someone new to the field. Next is aligning the stack. Now, most companies try to force you into this, and it's hard because, you know, developers have their own way of doing something. But if you can align the stack of what you're working on with your lead, it might help, right? And it does help with they're trying to address issues that you might be having, right? So your local development environment, right? Use the same processes and the same tools as your lead where it makes sense, right? If, you know, we're all IntelliJ, everyone's on IntelliJ, right? Don't go, hey, I want to use VS Code because I want to be different. That's, you know, that's not necessary. You might be comfortable with it, but just try to align the stack. Where I've seen constantly is, you know, I'm familiar with, you know, this, I learned this in college. I'm coming out and now I have to learn a new platform. Yeah, it's hard, and you have to go learn this new IDE. But on the other side, getting help is going to be a lot easier because it's what your team's using, it's what your lead's using. So try to align on it. Inversely, be different where it makes sense, right? I work with a lot of engineers who like to use Vim, but if your lead is using Vim, it has a high learning curve to it. So feel free to use any other text editor that might be easier to do. And on the other side of it, if you're a lead developer and you're looking at barriers to entry, Vim is not a good idea. So be different where it makes sense, but don't be different when you don't have to be, because when you need help, this is where it makes sense to get the best help faster. I want to talk about next is a cadence, right? And the reason why cadence comes into play is because just like anything else when you're learning, especially in software development, is doing something over and over and over. It makes it stick in your head, right? And we know this. It's called rote. Doing things over and over and over again, you get familiar with it. When you're writing in Java and you're trying to go over to Rust, and it's new. At first, it's difficult, but once you keep doing it and you have a cadence and you're going with it, you start picking it up and it becomes more and more natural to it. And then when you have to flip back to Java, it's starting over again, right? But the same thing with your lead is to set up some time with this individual, right? I always like coffee in the morning. It was like usually a 5 to 10 minute phone call. I had, an individual in Minneapolis, and I would get up and they would get up, and sometimes he was late, most of the time he was late, but that's just who he was personality wise. I answered emails and I answered his questions at the same time, and I drank my first cup of coffee with them. And it made life easier because, well, I was answering emails, but they got, my time. And next is a weekly, might be a little too much, or a bi-weekly check-in. And that's just for 30 minutes. Right. And I would do this with my junior developers because this was giving them an opportunity to ask a deeper question. Right. And you sometimes don't have enough time in that morning sync up, but that 30 minutes on a Friday afternoon, it's like, hey, what's going on? How was your week? What was stressful? Anything good? Anything you need help with? It kind of cleared the air with a lot of things. And I usually did it Friday afternoons because most of my management was gone for the weekend. They like to go play golf. And I was there with the junior developers, and I just opened up a channel and just said hi. Eventually, my bi-weekly check-ins were with all 3 of the junior developers I was always assigned to, and we just made it a group chat. And it was a lot easier for me because it was usually a 30-40 minute group chat versus a singular, I would say a singular one-on-one with these individuals. This can be in person or virtual. I've done them both. If you're in an office, obviously, if you can get it one that's in person, great. But if it's virtual, don't fret about it. We think we've got in the past couple of years, everyone's gotten pretty confident and comfortable with doing, a quick 15-minute, 5-minute, or even 30-minute phone call. You're here now for 45 minutes, so it couldn't be that bad, right? Always ask before you send the invite. And the reason why is no one likes to be surprised by it. So reach out, call, send a Slack message, whatever it might take, and say, hey, I'd like to set up just a bit of time, pick your brain. Can we do a daily coffee? Does that work for you? Or can we not? Try to be part of that routine, but ask before you send it. It's just a common courtesy with anyone. Even if they are assigned, they might not know this is what you're looking for and what you've done before. All right, so I want to talk about the grind, and this gift came perfectly through on grinding on any particular problem, right? And always ask if you don't know, but there's a way of asking that shows that you're learning and it causes a little less friction. And there's a way of asking that might sound like you could be just sandbagging or being lazy about it. And I always try to say is come with a direction on something that you don't know. And what I mean by that is you can ask something like, I was thinking about doing this a particular way. What are your thoughts on this, right? Versus, how should I do this? Because it's so open-ended, right? And it makes it sound like you didn't look at the card, you didn't look at the issue, you didn't look at something in a particular way. You just want them to answer it and kind of point directions, and they're looking to grow you, and you should be looking to grow yourself. And so always come back with it. Now, if you absolutely positively do not know, be clear about it. Be like, I have no idea what this is. Like, I haven't seen this in my trade school. I didn't learn this at Tech Elevator or in university. Can you point me in the right direction, right? but be honest and up clear about that if you truly do not know, if you haven't seen it before. And here's an important fact of when you're getting that feedback, especially when you're asking for help on something, is repeating back what you heard. Now, this can either be an email format, it could either be in verbally, whatever. I always liked it in email format. I always told people, like, hey, write it back in email so I just so I have it, right? And the reason why wasn't just for a paper trail so no one's in trouble or anything, but they put it to paper what they understood I said. And if I read that back and I said, oh, wait, before you start, that's not what I meant. I want it this way. It gives an opportunity of your understanding to make sure that like you translated exactly technically what they said correctly, and that there's no it's not disambiguous of what they said and what you heard. And then lastly is try not to grind on a problem too long. This is one thing that people, especially junior developers, they'll just jump on something and they go, and they feel embarrassed to ask. If you spend a reasonable amount of time on something, ask, right? I'd rather someone come back to me, if they've been on it a day and it's a 1-point card and they're grinding, I could have helped them in a 5-minute phone call, right? And a 5-minute phone call to clear them up, clear the air, get them going again. It's much easier for me than them wasting an entire day, because what happens is that you're frustrated. You've been on this, you've been on it for over 8 hours. You're going the wrong direction, and something that's as small as a phone call could have cleared the way, cleared the air, and let you continue forward is a better direction for that. Now, with all the junior developers I've had, and I had the pleasure of working with, we actually set up goals, right? And this was by accident at first, but then I learned that when I started helping them with goals, they started progressing further and further. And they weren't just progressing for their own sake, it was helping me out because I was spending less time with them. And they were building confidence, they were building their knowledge base, where things on a daily basis, I wouldn't hear from them because they were hitting benchmarks and they were hitting goals. And I was getting worried at times because I wouldn't hear from them, right? They're like, hey, I'm going to skip my meeting today. I'm good. I don't need anything. I'm going to go crank on this card. So setting goals is important. Now, when we talk about goals, we want to make sure that these are not necessarily the same goals that your manager might have, right? They could be similar, but they might not be, right? And so if we think about, I'm going to use the example of Git. Learning Git might be a goal, right? But your manager might have a goal of showing up on time, making all your meetings on time. So sometimes they align and sometimes they don't. And you're laughing is one of the things I learned is individuals in college would just show up sometimes and they would miss meetings with customers and like, where were you? George, you missed the whole meeting. The customer was waiting to hear from you. And they didn't realize how important that was. So sometimes it doesn't always align. So if you can't make them align, good. But if you can't, know that there's going to be something different. But why this is important is that your lead will see more of your skills than your manager, right? Because they're going to be working with you in the trenches. They're coding with you. They're doing your code reviews. They're pair programming with you. Whatever it might be, they're going to see a lot of your skill sets that your managers are not going to see, right? And it's unfortunate because a lot of times I always want a lead to do a personal review of an individual versus a manager, because a manager talks to them once a month maybe, or only when they did something wrong or showed up late or something. Where a lead would see your skill sets and they see what you're doing, they see your improvements, right? They're in the trenches with you, they're coding with you, and they should be giving that feedback. So I want to talk about goals that are a lot more than just technical, right? And if we look at our technical goals, it could be, I don't know, languages, frameworks. Let's go to live. Don't know what that means, but I will let Darren do that. Sorry. but technical goals could be, learning a new programming language, or, picking up a new framework, or being better with an IDE or a particular design principle or something like that, right? And those non-technical ones could be, I don't know, something as simple as team process, right? What does a pull request look like? Pull requests in every company that I've consulted with has been different. And some people have to have, 2 people sign off on it. Some people have to have 3 people, and then a DevOps engineer has to sign off on it. When sometimes a manager even has to sign off on a pull request. There's different processes to that. And so we want to address that. That's non-technical goals that one individual might have that are important. When we talk about the goals, we want to make them small but meaningful, right? And what I mean by that is there's something I learned when I was in the military many years ago. If you take care of the small things, the big things tend to take care of themselves, right? And I misquoted my own writing up there. Small goals can build upon each other to make a bigger goal seem not as big and daunting. And what I mean by that is, a small goal is learning .NET is a big, right? So if a developer comes in and says, my goal is to learn .NET. Well, that's a big undertaking. But if they came to me and said, hey, I want to learn the basics of Git, well, that's a much better and much easier thing to swallow for an individual to pick up on. Make sure the goal is aligned. And this was very, very difficult for a lot of the junior developers that I was working with at first, because what they'd come in and do is they would say, I want to learn iOS. And I'm like, what does that mean? I want to be an iOS developer. And I said, well, we don't do any iOS development. Our customers don't even do it. They usually, it's not in our wheelhouse. So how does that work? Align the goals to the stack or the technology that your company is working on, right? And so if you're going to say, hey, I want to learn React, it might not be that great of a goal if everything you're doing is Vue, right? Might not. It might make sense. Or if it's, like the example with, iOS development, and your shop doesn't do any iOS development, it's kind of a hard goal to align to, because it's not something you're going to be touching or working with on a daily basis. But they don't have to be technical. And I mentioned it before, even something as simple as a pull request, and the process to do that is an important goal that anyone can set, and it can be measured, right? One of the things that we talked about is this thing called set, check, and proceed. With goals, it's a quick aspect of things that we were doing with, some of the juniors on our team, or even the mid-levels, is you set your goal, right? I'm gonna learn the basics of Git, right? You check in regularly, like, hey, how are you with that? You're feeling comfortable? You having any issues? What's, what are some of the commands that you're using, right? And then when you feel comfortable, you can proceed on to that next goal, right? So that's what we had this little triangle here, and it made it a lot easier, because then you kind of, write it down, you knew what to do with it, and then you made it almost like a checklist of things that you did with your particular lead. So when you set your goals, if it's too ambitious, break it down to smaller ones. I use the example of, GitHub, right? Or not GitHub, but Git commands. And I'll talk about that in a minute. If it's too big or it's too ambitious, break it down to something smaller, right? Ask for feedback and make sure you're aligned with your skills, right? Set a goal that's aligning to what you're working on. I like to learn something new, but if it's not aligning to what my company was doing, it's kind of hard for having someone, assist me with it, especially if your lead doesn't know, right? And I've had, like I said, junior developers wanting to be iOS developers, and I've never done iOS development. I couldn't help them. And then setting benchmarks, right? When do you feel comfortable enough to move on from those particular goals? And one of the best ways I explain this is I always talk about the basics of Git, right? And it's an easy way to set your benchmarks for it. Can I go through these commands without Googling what they are? If you can kind of go through your process of checking your code, committing it, and then firing off a pull request, that's a great first 2 goals of any individual. But if you look on the other side of it and you're saying, I want to just learn Git, I don't remember last time I had a junior developer come to having to do a Git tag. right? Because it just wasn't part of their workflow. But these other commands were part of their workflow, and it made it easier for them to pull code, do what they needed to do, check it in, commit it. And then inversely, we would then put the goal of learn how to pull our change request process, right? Learn how to do a pull request in our system. And those are two amazing goals because, well, you had to learn the basics of Git, and then you had to learn the basics of, how we get our code from my machine or their machine into development, and then from development all the way up to production. It was a good first 1-2 goals for that. So work with your lead on where to find that at. And what I mean by that is, are you comfortable moving on? Right. And so if you look at, the change control process, if you're not asking questions and you're getting it every time and you're it's become almost rote, it's almost routine for doing it, feel free to move on. Right. Is it, did you hit your benchmark? I can do a full pull request without Googling my Git commands, without asking anybody about, the whole process. I feel like I hit those benchmarks and I can move on. And then solicit feedback. Be like, hey, was, anything I can do to, with this, I struggled anywhere you think I struggled with. Most of the time your lead will say no, but sometimes individuals will say, it's like, hey, you just kept going out of order with our change control process. You really, need to hammer this away and work on this area right here. And I think if you can do that, the next goal might be a lot easier for you to pick up. And if all these are met, feel free to proceed to the next one, right? And your next goal might be, hey, I want to learn, I need to learn this new framework in Spring. We're going to be picking up in the next, sprint or two. I want to take a moment and, just become a little more familiar with what this looks like. All right. When you and your lead have kind of agreed that you're ready to focus and move on to the next goal, feel free to pick up what you should be working on next, right? It might be expanding your knowledge in Git commands. It might be expanding into a different framework, right? And it might not build upon the previous. So understand that. And that's something that's pretty important. Next is, how do you keep it fresh? And what I mean by that is, if the pull request is the process of pull requests, you're going to be doing that at this company for as long as you're going to be here, right? Unless you move out of development. But how do you keep that particularly fresh? Now, there's times that's not going to happen, right? If the next sprint or two you're working on a queuing system, it's putting messages on a queue, and or something, a processor picks it up and processes it and dumps it to a database. You might not be working on that, often, but you need to ramp in and have an understanding of that architecture, those design principles, and the Spring library that might happen. But if you forget, do you know how to go back and find it, right? One of the things that junior developers feel weird about is Googling something, and I still have to Google things today, and I don't think there's anybody out there who doesn't Google something. And we get to Stack Overflow and someone's like, oh yeah, that's how we did it. This is the best way to find it. So if you are moving on and you cannot keep something fresh, then take a moment and understand what it might be would take, to go find the correct answer, right? And if I gave that example of, a queuing framework in Spring, do I know where the Spring documentation is to go find that again, to go jump back into it? Where's my company documentation? Who wrote it? What does that look like? So I can jump back in if I had to work on a ticket or an enhancement to that system. Okay, there it is. All right, some final thoughts. There's no real timeline for goals, right? This is going to be an ongoing thing. And one of the reasons why I say there's no timeline for it is that you shouldn't say, hey, within 2 sprints, I should be able to knock this out. People learn at different rates. You might not be doing, as many check-ins as you might have thought. You might be spending 2 or 3 days or even more reading documentation or ramping up on something else. And you might not be doing those Git commands. So do not put a timeline on it. And if your lead puts a timeline on it, I'd question whether that's important for them to have that timeline there. There it is. This is not just about being technical. This is also personal. And what I mean by that is that as a development team, we start, there's this thing called storming, forming, storming, and norming. And teams do this, right? And so it's not just about your technical skills that are coming out. It's also, there's a personal aspect. You're building a rapport with your lead. Your lead's now starting to trust you with more and more things. They're having confidence that you know what you're doing with their guidance and with your drive to learn more, do more. And so it's, these goals and working with your lead is not just technical, right? It's also, there's a personal aspect of that as well, right? So I want to make sure that, I call that out is because, when your leads, you build a little bit of rapport with these individuals, and it works both ways, that they're going to trust you to take on harder, difficult, more challenging tasks to push you outside of your comfort zone. And lastly is to have patience. This is hard on both sides. This is not something that's easy for anyone, right? So even people who've been a lead for years, I've been a lead developer for 7 years of my career. I've had people underneath me. If even to this day, I still find it challenging, right? And I still have the human moments where I get frustrated, but have patience on both sides. I tell people who are new to being a lead and people who are new to being a developer or an engineer, this is going to take time, and this is going to need some patience on your side as well, right? And with that being said, I do have a few minutes for questions. I was good with that. Again, if you want to follow me on Twitter, Robert Search pretty much anywhere you can find me. I'm also at community.suse.com. That's where I work. That's where I answer a ton of questions in the ecosystem where people go sign up and learn about Kubernetes and what all the stuff I do at work. So you can find me at either one of that. And I believe that is it. I'm going to stop sharing here. There it is. Turn it over for any questions that anyone might have in the 5 minutes I have left of this. Mr. Don Peters. Don, welcome. See you on the board.
Hey, it's been a while. It's safeguard days, right?
Safeguard days, sir.
Yeah, so good talk. I saw this come up because, I lead 2 teams now, and some of the junior developers, they don't, communicate real well. So it's trying to get some tips on how to help them communicate better. Some developers like to sit in their cubby and not talk. They just want to be fed requirements and code stuff. And, you have to learn how to talk to business people, end users, everybody. So very good talk.
Sir, thank you. Let's see here in the chat. What do you do when you have 5 days in a role and the manager tells you you are going slow? This is development, right? And if you are going slow, you're going slow. People have different skill sets, and they have different skill sets, and they will ramp up in time. What I've learned is when you push too hard, you usually get pushed back. And so it's just, setting expectations and leveling with individuals with those particular requirements that are coming through and those particular individuals. So what I mean by that is you can tell the managers like, hey, this needs 5 days, and there could have been other complexities. And if the individual is struggling as a team, we owe it to those individuals to help bring them up and to help foster that through. So that is what feedback I would get to that. It's just, you can push people, but again, you're going to get a pushback that you really don't want with that. Recording, I do believe a recording. This is my first talk with Codementor. I do believe we are recording right now. When you came into the Zoom right here has told you that you were recording. I don't know where Codementor is going to do it, but feel free to ping me either on LinkedIn, Twitter, Slack, whatever you can find me. Once I get that, I will tweet that link out. I will put it on all my social channels. So if you don't see it through Codementor, I'll ask Darren where the recording might be. I think there might be a YouTube channel for it. And if it's there, please go back and watch it again. All right, let's see. Managing a team of developers across different platforms. However, it's quite stiff communicating ideas across developers. Does it? Okay, so when you're on, if you're on different platforms doing like different types of development, are you trying to communicate ideas between the two platforms, or like can you kind of expand on that? And if we don't have time, we can take this offline. And while they're kind of applying that, is Agile suitable for managers, scrum masters, and startups? That depends on the startup, right? And so it's an organizational thing, right? And so where I've seen water and then Agile is when there's 2-3 developers and they just charge forward and they go that way. And the process of being Agile is just a little heavier with, larger teams that we have to break apart into multiple sub teams. Having a particular set of Agile principles in there have worked better. So it depends on that. I don't want to answer, but it's an organizational thing. And depending on how many developers you have and what you're actually building might be a better answer to that. All right. Any more questions? We have 36 that showed up today. So I want to thank everybody. Do appreciate it. I see some familiar faces with Don Peters here. Don and I worked together quite a number of years ago. I probably need to call him and take this offline and go commiserate about some of the things that we've done.
Probably closing on 10 years ago now, huh?
Yeah, it has been. But everybody who did show up, I want to thank you all. I want to thank Darren from Codementor for allowing me to do this talk. This is something I'm very passionate about. I love helping people out. I love seeing new developers come up through the ranks, and anything I can do to make more developers, more engineers, make their lives easier, I like to do that. So with that being said, thank you all, and I will see you guys either in the community, Twitter, Slack, or even LinkedIn. So feel free to connect, and I'd love to keep the conversation going. All right. Thanks, everybody.